Well, welcome and thank you for joining us for this live Zoom event on representation and why it matters. This is a standard Zoom, not a webinar, so please mute yourself. And we anticipate the Zoom lasting for less than an hour, and we are recording the Zoom. So we strive to be inclusive communicators, so we have enabled closed captioning, and you can post questions or access needs in the chat. My name is Sue Kelso. I'm a co-founder of the Good Heart Artist Residency. It's a beautiful day here in Good Heart, sunny and just gorgeous. I describe myself as an older white woman with graying reddish hair, and I'm wearing reading glasses and a black top. We are Zooming today from our home in Good Heart, which is just right up the street from the residency. And the residency is located in northern Michigan on the ancestral lands of the Wagonoxing Odawa people. Bill, another co-founder, is joining me here also, but off screen. He'll keep an eye on the chat. And if you have any questions or comments, please post them in the chat. There will be time for questions after the panel discussion. Okay, I want to thank all of the writers involved and our moderator. All of them are alumni of the Good Heart Arts Residency program. So thank you, Carlina Duan, Joumana Altallal, Monica Rico, and Timothy Bradley. Thank you, thank you. They will be sharing some of their writing and their thoughts on the theme of representation matters. And also thank you to Rebecca Lynn for moderating. I want to thank our volunteers, our donors, our board members, and the organizations you see here on the screen. I'll read those: Michigan Arts and Culture Council, National Endowment for the Arts, Arts Midwest, and Sustainable Arts Foundation. All of you help to support this program and as we work to nurture artists, writers, and composers. All right, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And there you all are. Lovely, lovely. Thank you for joining us. Good to see you all. So we're in our 10th year of hosting Creative People in Good Heart. And this program is one of our 10-year anniversary events. We've worked with many artists, writers, and composers, and we've become more and more aware of how important and affirming it is for a person to see themselves represented in the arts, in what they read, what they see on television, in movies, and in society in general. An example is a poetry reading that Monica Rico did for us a couple of years ago. And in that reading, she shared about how as a child, she didn't find many books that really reflected her and her heritage. And when I think about that reading, I vividly remember her talking about her mother's enchiladas and her grandmother's tortillas. And just a shame if that is not represented in the arts, those type of rich cultural heritage things. So we wanted to shed more light on this topic and representation and why it matters. I invited the Good Heart alumni writers to participate, and these panelists step forward to share. I look forward to listening to your discussion. I'll introduce Rebecca Lynn, the moderator for the panel, and she will in turn introduce each of the panelists. So Rebecca Lynn is a two-spirit bead artist, social activist, and a member of the Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa Indians. Rebecca is the leader of the Wagonoxing Nagwagan. You can correct me here, Becca. Close. Two-spirit group. Go ahead, Becca.
Close. Nagwagan.
Nagwagan. Thank you. She's also the owner of Queer Quee Designs. Rebecca's art aims to create representation for LGBTQ plus and two-spirit Indigenous folks by combining modern pride flags in her traditional beadwork. Rebecca is also an alumni of this residency program. She attended her residency in the fall of 2021. And we are currently contracting with Rebecca to facilitate the upcoming June 10th Rhythm and Roots LGBTQ plus celebration of the arts. So thank you, Rebecca, for working with us on all of these things. All right, with that, I will turn it over to Rebecca to get the discussion started.
Yeah, thank you, Sue. So as Sue said, my name is Becca. I wanted to take a few minutes to open the topic of representation. And the best way I know how to represent myself and my community is to introduce myself in the language. Anishinaabe. So, Ani Buju, Becca Indijnikas, Magizi and Dodam, Baraske and Donjaba, Waganaxing Odawa and Dow. So what I said is, hello, my name is Becca. I'm Eagle Clan. I'm from the Little Traverse Babans of Odawa Indians in Petoskey, Michigan. I didn't fully realize Sue was going to do my whole introduction that way, so I'm gonna skip forward on that. But as an alumni, I am really excited to be here. And while I'm not a writer per se, I explore the idea of representation exhaustively through both my work and my lived experience as an Indigenous person. It is easy to say the statement representation matters, but what does that mean and why are we having this conversation? To understand this, we need to take a quick step back and look at history through a critical lens. Context is crucial. For centuries, marginalized voices have been silenced, mocked, exoticized, and appropriated in all forms of media, primarily for the benefit of rich, white, heterosexual, cisgendered, able-bodied men in power. The level of harm created by this history of exclusion to both individuals and entire communities is immeasurable. Mere representation without systematic change is not enough to combat this harm. Moving forward, we all need to prioritize uplifting and supporting marginalized voices, especially in areas where there has been historically misrepresentation and exclusion, such as art, literature, film, and other creative fields. Diverse representation truly benefits us all. There is so much beauty in seeing the world through different perspectives, opening our eyes to the vastness of the human experience, and holding space for all members of our communities. When people are able to authentically represent themselves, powerful change happens. With all that being said, I'm so grateful to be a part of this event and for Sue inviting me here and for the work that her and Bill are doing to really try to show up for marginalized folks. We have a talented lineup of writers who all offer important perspectives through their work. Each of these individuals explore themes of identity, place, community, and power as they thoughtfully craft every piece. I've gotten to personally connect with most of the panelists here today, and you're all in store for a powerful and meaningful panel this evening. I will introduce the writers one by one, and they will perform their reading after being introduced. I've prepared a couple of questions for the panelists once the readings are done, and we will have time at the end for audience questions. As Sue said, please just put those in the chat. So I'd like to introduce our first writer. Carlina Duan was a resident from September 20th to October 4th in 2022. Carlina Duan is a poet from Michigan and the author of the poetry collections I Wore My Blackest Hair and Alien Miss. Her poems have appeared or are forthcoming in Poetry Magazine, Narrative Magazine, Poets.org, the Kenyon Review, and other places. Carlina completed a Good Heart Artist Residency in the fall of 2022, where she was a featured writer at the Harbor Springs Festival of the Book and facilitated a sports writing workshop at Harbor Springs High School. She currently serves as a poetry editor of Michigan Quarterly Review and is currently a PhD candidate in the joint program in English and Education at the University of Michigan. Among many things, she loves river walks, snail mail, and being a sister. Go ahead, Carlina.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Becca, for the introduction. Thank you so much, Sue and Bill and all the folks in the Good Heart community for supporting, making space for this event. I have all the love in the world for the Good Heart residency folks. So I'm just thrilled to be here and sending gratitude to all of my fellow panelists, Monica, Tim, Joumana. I feel so blessed to get to share space with you all today. So I'm actually just going to start by reading two poems. And I'll say give a little bit of context about each poem, why I've chosen to read it. And then, yeah, I'm really looking forward to getting in the conversation later on. So the first poem that I'm going to start with comes from my second book of poems, Alien Miss. And this was a collection that I actually wrote thinking largely about historical representation. So I wrote in context with the Chinese Exclusion Acts and the Page Acts of the 1880s. And I was thinking about kind of a multiplicity of stories and expanding the kind of historical record. So the poem that I'll read references Angel Island Immigration Station on the West Coast, and it also remixes language from the Star Spangled Banner, as well as language from an 1885 broadside letter that was addressed to Congress protesting the ill treatment of the Chinese in the context of the Chinese Exclusion Acts. So I'll start with this poem. It's called Alien Miss Consults Her Past. Alien Miss consults her past. On Angel Island, she finds a bolt of blue linen cloth, moles on the chest, boats, men who boarded them, bound for a golden country to pave, to stave off hunger, labor, what's an American dream but a debt, a price to pay, how to say, longing, longing, oh, say, can you see? Vowels opened, bare feet hitting the grass, lawn sprawls of land, touching foot to ground, foot to hardwood floor, water, then more water, slats of light against a lawn wall, saying her own name to a room, holding a pool of water on the tongue, saying her own name to a tree, to another head, its river of hair matted on the pillow, barred from entry, barred from country, barred while carrying a chain link fence, lawful, feral, fearful, what's in the past is in the past is in the past. Quote, that these threats and intimidations and riotous bloody acts in this nation which claims to be a leading nation in intelligence, morality, and culture, shock our sense of national pride. The past is in the future in a woman who strips down before crawling into a barrack's lonely bed. Above her, the cloth hangs to dry, goosebumps on the skin, practices saying the words out loud. By the dawn's early light, what so proudly we hailed, what so proudly we hailed, what so proudly, so, oh. So that's that first poem. And if you could see the page, it kind of disintegrates. So the language sort of disintegrates and it ends on that single O. So I'm just going to read one more poem. I was thinking about the kind of topic of representation matters. And I think one of the ways that I think about kind of representing my own community and representing my own communal experience as a Chinese American growing up in the Midwest is thinking specifically about language and thinking also about the kind of history of inheriting Chinese, losing Chinese, and also what it means to carry my name. And essentially kind of carry my whole lineage of elders and ancestors living within my name. So this is a poem that I actually finished at Good Heart when I was here over the fall. I've never actually gotten to read it out loud, but it's coming out in the Kenyon Review, so it's very exciting. So I'm going to read this poem next, and this is the last poem I'll read. It's written as a kind of multiple choice, and so you'll kind of hear me reference like choice A, choice B, etc. It's called After She Mispronounces My Name for the Fourth Time, and it starts with an epigraph in Mandarin. 一段感情, a period of feeling, a relationship. A, the muscle on my cheek quivers, so I wrench myself again into a semblance of a smile. B, I laugh low into the microphone and softly begin to hum as if I were an engine or a witch. C, I interrupt her. I remember her name, the same name shared by my sister, who once, when we were smaller, took my hand into hers and pressed into it, crushed by salt, a goldfish. If you choose A, I tell her every spring, right before the magnolia begin to bud, there's a small song made by the crickets and the frogs and the spaces gaping in between my chest. And in the warble of all that green sound, my name emerges, not a twig to snap between your teeth, but a tender living thing. Hear it, Carlina, oh thistle, oh holographic beetle skin, Carlina, speak it, cool consonants and letters flanked by such delicious earthy mud. If you choose B, I tell her nothing at all. If you choose C, I interrupt her to say it right, Carlina Duan, and within each syllable butchered by Roman letters, there sits my grandmother on a cushion whose last name, Ying, means silver, a glint, a flash. Each time you say my name, you carry her, and every dip and curl of the A, the Ah, the C to shining C. If you choose all of the above, I interrupt her to tell her how once in a cab in Kuala Lumpur, the driver was delighted to hear me say it. You're a Duan, he said, tracing the Mandarin character through the air with the swoop of his finger, and seeing my dumbfounded glee, went on. Yi Duan Ganqing, he said, Duan, as in, quite literally, a period of feeling. Outside, the city slipped by, squiggly with fluorescent lights, and down came my awe, swinging. I held it close, the character shorn down to its root, the meaning like a small fish in my mouth, finally plump with breath and gleaming. That's that poem. Thank you. Excited to talk more.
That was beautiful. Thank you for sharing. We got to move on to the next writer now, and that's going to be Timothy Bradley. Timothy Bradley is a New York-based fiction writer and playwright whose work combines realist, speculative, and experimental approaches to explore contemporary queer experience. He has been published in Foglifter Journal and has received residencies and awards from the Tin House Summer Workshop, Bread Loaf Writers Conference, Suwannee Writers Conference, and Good Heart. He holds a BA in literature from Yale and an MFA in creative writing from Hunter College. He is currently working on a play, a short story collection, and his first novel, which together address themes ranging from queer aging to climate change to artificial intelligence and authenticity. Go ahead, Tim.
Thank you, Becca. Thank you, Bill and Sue. Thank you to all my fellow panelists. I'm going to jump right in here. I'm reading from a short story that basically imagines two gay men meeting for the first time during the early stages of the pandemic. The story is called After You've Gone. In an early phase of lockdown, I would stumble 5 flights down to the basement for the dumbest reasons, lugging dirty socks, towels, gloves, my roommate Angie's yoga gear, because the laundry room was somewhere to go, and I was terrified then of stepping out into what I imagined to be Chicago's lethally contaminated air. After loading the machine, I'd collapse on the frayed yellow couch and pass entire washing drying cycles cruising online, scrolling through apps for cock, the apps for love, barely noticing anymore the ugly crack splintering my screen. I tumbled my way through political diatribes, hoarded screenshots of gym bulges and private smiles like they were meant for me. Fresh debates appeared with chilling echoes about risk, safety. Oh God, I thought, what dreadful vocabulary must we learn now? If nothing else, the gay internet gossip was one way to know what the hell was going on in the world, also one way to avoid it. What I was looking for, what I was into, as the men online asked, was hard to say. I had yet to rebound after 6 years with my ex, 5 years since my mother's passing, and now just days into a public health debacle that no one seemed to understand, my graphic design gigs had frozen overnight. Without sidetracks, cranberry vodkas to set my course for the weekend and drag watch parties to cackle through with my so-called friends, what I was into now was wondering how I'd turn 43, more doughy than beefy, single as a loaf of sourdough, gorging on baking shows and back-to-back reruns of the Golden Girls while living off checks from the Illinois Department of Employment Security. The Ides of March are come, Angie whispered in a ghoulish hush when the first check arrived. Ides sent me weekly checks so long as I said I was looking for work. I was not looking for work. I wasn't resume tweaking or doing the gluteal workouts my doctor prescribed for my knee. Angie insisted the theater must go on. She was a ride or die stage manager wonder worker, but I was not so emboldened, was not resuscitating the stop motion animation short I had made years ago about Mr. Wembley, the detective made of clay. I wondered if our buddy-buddy shtick from college would get us through this new phase of doorknob disinfecting. The worries and rage we shared over morning coffees in our cramped two-bedroom was like those plodding flashbacks Rose and Blanche and Dorothy shared around their kitchen table, reminiscing until the present blurred into the past. Picture it. March 2020, a white cis male homosexual wakes to find his beard gray, eyes puffy and pale. His suitors call out, Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your hair, but his thinning wig falls off and they tumble to the ground in a billowing cloud. Poor pussycat. In my recurring dream, an underground parking garage appeared as a maze of false turns and rusting corridors. Freight trucks obstructed the way until finally I ascended the exit ramp, triumphant only to see the car doors open and wheeze out all the passengers. When I finally summoned the nerve to go outside, the block was dead. People were home, I knew, because I passed the old ladies speaking Ukrainian on my way to the grocery, or I'd sit on a bench before the tiled mosaic of the Catholic Church, nodding to the balding groundskeeper who climbed the stairs with his wash bucket and paint roller, preparing for something special, I imagined. Fatso's still served hot dogs. Thank God we had hot dogs. And the noodle shop a few blocks down steamed up like nothing would ever slow them down. It was our languid winter thaw infused with my decaying ambitions, my melting grief and yearning for a reset, for spring. After one of my walks, I said to Angie, who was sprawled out at the kitchen table with her highlighters and scripts, you forget about buds. Not you, but I do. I forget how in April those little twiggies come to life. And Angie said without looking up, of course you forget. You never water the plants. You don't even talk to them. You have to talk to them. Right, I said, right. I was going to water the plants. Sorry, my attention span, my focus has gotten so, I've just been the toll. Anyway, I rummaged under the sink for the watering can, but Angie cut the gesture short. It's by the radiator, she said, but you don't need to water them. I've got them on a schedule. A few weeks into our numbing apocalypse, a photo popped up of this guy hoisting a crate of apples onto a pickup. Fat tires, red glare, butch like a truck commercial. What caught my eye, though, was the color of his cowboy hat, pink. So camp, so unnecessary, frivolous, my screech echoed off the laundry room walls. His next pick, a headshot, got me. Cordless one, had a sweet, round face, but an avenging glare. You could eat him if he didn't gobble you up first. His buzzed jet black hair and wispy beard would have fit in at the jackhammer, but I'd never seen him out before. He was 32, self-described as mixed, living in Edgewater just north of me. Interests, horror films, ping pong, falafel, fixing shit. He was cute. We'd probably never meet in normal times. So I glanced again at his apple picking and messaged, Honey Crisp or Golden Delicious? By the time I climbed back up the 5 flights and dumped the laundry on the living room couch, please don't sit on the clean laundry, Angie would plead. A text bubble had returned, pink lady. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. We're gonna hop right into the third panelist. Joumana Altallal is an Iraq-Lebanese writer, researcher, and artist who was born in Baghdad and grew up in Charlottesville. She received her MFA in poetry from the University of Michigan. Joumana is currently working on her first book, which focuses on American spectatorship and the commodification of violence in post-2003 Iraq.
Thank you, Becca. Thank you, Bill and Sue, for inviting me, and to all the panelists. It's a gift to be sharing this space with you all. I am going to be reading poems from a series that I'm working on, poems that are in the voice of different victims of femicide in Iraq. So women who have been killed for various reasons, whether during protests or simply for being women. I'll start with the first one. It's called Everything Here. And it's in the voice of Tara Faris, who is or who was a social media influencer in Iraq and was shot in her car. And all of these poems are from an afterlife where these women are speaking back. Everything here. Delirious, I am laid to rest in the clavicle of a bird whose remaining body is a ghost. In the next life, death has the sense not to creep around me, breathe my air. Bright, bright, this new world, and ugly, to have been taught nothing remains of my body and still my limbs, what to make of no one watching, no rush, nothing to return to but a mildewed grief. Here there is space, and nothing will fill it. Some days I dream no one is watching. I dream I am small, standing beneath the rim of a graying sky, my supine body a willow leaf carried in the quivering wind. All I wanted was to be left alone, to drive a beautiful car, to veer to the edge and quiver against a beloved's body. Instead, I am rosined into the earth, brittle as bone. Someone's look what happens when you look what happens. How many have died in my name and inherited death? I touch their rosined bodies now, their old loves, the amber that fills them. There is everything here, and no one is watching. This next poem is called On Returning, and it's in the voice of Doski Azad, who was a trans Iraqi woman who was killed by her brother. On returning. Since no one else will, I carry my own corpse through the valley of musk mallows, sweeping with each step their flowering discs, the curled bracts. My departure leaves behind no questions. Someone's whisper, it was only a matter of time. A woman like that disgusts. At night, I return to find myself stepped over and left to be found. In a borderless body, I flood the sleeping streets, delight in the night's inattention. What pleasure in remaining unobserved when the night is just night, not danger, not hawk-eyed. I hold a procession, then pass myself by. And this last poem I will read is in the voice of Riham Yaqub, who was an Iraqi woman, doctor, and incredible person who was protesting in 2019 in the city of Basra. Afterlife diptych. And the morning after we woke up, wedged in shrubs of myrtle, our half legs flapping like windsocks from mounted poles, the face of a pupilless God behind us. God, we began, no longer starved with the urgency of the living, God of water, of electricity, of rooftop sleep and summer's unend, what remains there? There, in what we have left of Basra's glutted sky, why did you not come to us as you come to others? In sleep, in the gentle pull of the first light, we hobble to stand, our bodies, ours, and wanting. I was a marbled teal bobbing in the unnamed water. When I was neither dead nor alive, I preferred it to this sterile heaven, to this revolving concert of faces. Nearby, Fuad Salim hums, "Don't come to us. Don't." The neighbor's son scrapes rosin from bumber trees, builds kites of palm spines and thread. What spooled blessings, what terror in the small lives we no longer live. Thank you.
That was beautiful. I feel like it's hard to just keep going, but we'll have time for discussions. Okay, so our final panelist is Monica Rico, who was a writer in residency in January 2021. Monica Rico is a Canto Mundo Fellow and Macondista who grew up in Saginaw, Michigan. She is an MFA graduate of the University of Michigan's Helen Zell Writers Program, winner of a Hopwood Graduate Poetry Award, a 2021 Ballard Spar Prize for Poetry finalist, and a 2021 winner of the Levis Prize in Poetry, selected by Kava Akbar. Monica is a program manager and editor-in-chief of the Bear River Writers Conference. Monica's first book, Pinion, is forthcoming from Four Way Books. Go ahead, Monica.
Hello. Thanks so much for having me here. I'm so happy to be here listening to all of you read. It is absolutely joyous to hear two writers I so deeply admire, Carlina and Joumana. Your work just blows me away. And Timothy, I loved your selection. I am a fan now too. All right, so I'll read my piece. I wrote this at Goodheart, and I wrote it the day of the inauguration. Mexican in Michigan. Because I know the inauguration is happening and the first woman of color is being sworn into the office of Vice President of the United States, I decide to do something I have never done and go for a walk alone in the somewhat isolated country of northern Michigan. The temperature has dropped 10 degrees in the last week. It is cold, and I cannot tell if I'm listening to the wind or Lake Michigan. Sometimes I am not sure there is a difference. The ground is 90% ice. I have a walking stick and crampons, but I move too quickly. I can feel my pulse rise to my face, even though I know there is almost no one in this area, less than 10 families for miles. Once I am blocked by a dune, there is a hush of wind, and I hear an almost groan. When I pause to look around, it is the tree bending ever so slightly. I continue and notice I am walking next to my own frozen footsteps from 2 days ago. I turn around and put my foot into them to be certain, then continue on to Church Beach. Walking somewhere always feels longer than it is. I notice the footprints of a rabbit and crow. I am thinking of my parents, and even after 54 years of marriage, my father still chokes up about his honeymoon. Not because he loves my mother too much, though he does, but because on the second day up north, my father was hit by a drunk driver. A man so intoxicated that after he hit my father, he kept going at full speed into a telephone pole. When the cops came, they told my father to calm down. His 1964 GTO convertible had been destroyed, but it wasn't that. Instead, the cop was giving my father a ticket and demanding he pay for the telephone pole. I can see the bright white church, and Lake Michigan is speaking again. I never get sick of smelling the water before I see it, like the second before it rains. When I clear the dune, I get blasted with the wind from Lake Michigan, and the sun surfaces its head. My face is beginning to burn, but I am smiling. I've lived too long not to do this. To have this moment, these waves and sea foam dance for me. I wish my parents were with me. I wish this view of brown to green to blue to black was theirs. I try to take a video, but I don't want to look at the screen. Lake Michigan is saying something. She is throwing the veils of her dress back and forth. She is so loud, I cannot hear the seagull, but watch its shadow. I pull the collar of my wool sweater that I used as a scarf earlier back up around my face, and the condensation of my breath has frozen in the time I've been here. I'm glad to end the last 4 years here on the land of the Odawa, although I do not know what to feel about the church and its garden of crosses. I hold the guardrail. The lake is an orchestra, I think. The rabbit, crow, and now the arc of my own footsteps create little disruption. Thank you.
First of all, I want to thank each of you for being vulnerable with all of us today by sharing your work and your experience as writers. Powerful words were shared today. I do have a couple questions prepared, and I'll just chime in. We're not going in any order. But because we're all, well, I'm including myself in this, but as writers who highlight underrepresented stories and experiences, how do you hold both authentically representing yourself and subsequently your communities in your work?
I can jump in quickly. Yeah, what an incredible beginning question. And I think it's something that at least all the writers I've encountered have had to contend with. I think for me, more recently, the more that I've grown into my writing, the more that it has meant to step away from the feeling of needing to represent a community at large at all, or even thinking about my writing as representative of a larger community. And it's difficult to do, particularly when there are no other examples or very few other examples out like in the book market. And so whatever you produce as a writer ends up becoming the one thing. But it has meant a lot to me to also understand the idea that like so many people are looking at, in my case, at Iraqis as a homogenous group, as it is, despite the fact that we're absolutely not a homogenous group. And then remembering that that thought process is the same thing that I am kind of like putting on myself as a burden when I'm writing, even though I can stand against it and kind of like pull it apart, I still kind of feel this pressure, right? And so for me, it's just meant like stepping away from that, being cognizant of myself, kind of looking at my writing in the same lens that I'm trying to resist.
Yeah, Joumana, I will kind of tap in here. I think I love what you said about finding that as you continue to write, that you maybe feel less of an urge or need to write in representation of a community, but really write for oneself. And I think I really resonate with that. I think that for me, when I was writing my last project, Alien Miss, I was contending with a lot of archival documents and thinking specifically about silences within archives, silences and also overwritings or maybe misrepresentations within archives in particular. But as I started to kind of write my way into the archives, I felt like I was writing most closely into people that I loved and people that I knew. So folks like my sister, you know, my grandmother, my elders, my favorite Chinese folk singer, just kind of people that I felt like I actually had proximity with. And so I think with response to your question, Becca, about how do you authentically represent yourself and how do you represent your community, I think I really just held, for me, I held love and care for the people that I love so close. And I think that throughout the entire book, I really wanted to make sure that I was writing from a place of tenderness and a place of care and making space for the joy of the people and the relationships that I know, alongside, of course, contending with the violence and contending with the erasure and the trauma of these kinds of histories that are oftentimes not told to us or that are oftentimes erased. But I think it felt really important for me thinking from, just kind of thinking in proximity with real people, like humans that are in my world that I truly love. How do I actually manifest and sort of co-create space for that to live on the page?
I love that. And that kind of goes back to our conversation earlier about thinking more decolonially, you know, celebrating the joy, celebrating the tenderness, and taking that sort of shame and pressure off of yourself to create. Did Monica or Tim want to chime in on that, or should I move to the next question?
Those are such great responses. I think I would just add that I think for me, coming into queerness involved partly accepting that I was going to be kind of doing something that was deeply personal because that was somehow in opposition or to a kind of heteronormative straight culture that I grew up around. And so I think I found a kind of freedom in queerness to say, I'm going to do it my way and not worry about whether or not it's sort of adhering to a script. At the same time, I do feel very aware that there's so many kind of queer stories now that can be told, that are being told. And I think I've received encouragement, advice from people to sort of trust that if the sort of leaning into the authenticity of your story has power and has and that people, the more kind of authentic you are to yourself, the more universality you might be able to find. So it's a tricky question it's probably resolving itself and as I go along, but those are some of the ideas that I'm working with.
All right, I think I'm going to move on to the next question. So in our previous discussions, many of you mentioned struggling to navigate the ethical minefields as artists and writers. We talked about everything from working with publishing companies to language and accessibility, representing self and community, avoiding stereotypes and exotification, and so much more. How do you navigate the ethics of a literary world, especially coming from marginalized communities with limited existing representation?
I can start. I don't know that I have like a concrete fully resolved response to this yet. I think that the question of ethics is one that I'm certainly still trying to navigate in my own work, especially as I write with pre-existing source material, oftentimes like legal rhetoric. I think for me, the question of ethics becomes really a question of an ethics of care. Like who am I sort of writing towards, and how am I thinking about, for me, the stories that were being told to me as a young person, and really honoring the stories of my family, honoring the stories of my elders. And I want to go back something Joumana said too about the kind of not homogenous, like not having like one homogenous story, which I think is the danger of course, stereotypes, but also when you only have limited stories that are available in the literary world, of course, there becomes this kind of dangerous siloing that happens within the way that some stories become representative of quote unquote all, which is why I think there just needs to be multiple simultaneous, like expansive storytelling. And so I think going back to how I think about ethics, I think, the poet Rita Dove actually talks about, for her, the difference between kind of fact and essence, and that for her, as a poet, it's important for her to kind of get true at the essence of something, sometimes over the fact of something else. And so it doesn't, she's talking about writing about her grandparents, and that, perhaps she doesn't get to the fact of what color scarf her grandfather was wearing. Was it yellow or green? What matters for her is the essence of that scarf. And that's actually a really useful distinction for me when I think about writing poetry about a historical event that directly impacts lived and living bodies today. I think a little bit about, how do I remain accountable and honest to the kind of emotional interior essence of something? And for me, I think a lot of that is, can I read the poem to, my sister? Can I read the poem to, a trusted family friend or family member within my own community in Michigan? And I don't want my poetry to be taken as like, oh, I'm writing the Chinese American historical poetry book, but rather it's just one, hopefully in a long lineage of what's to come, and the few that there are amazing, Chinese American poets who have been writing about the Chinese Exclusion Acts, Angel Island, all of that. But I'm hopeful that, I guess when I think about ethics, that if I can read the poem to my sister and have her say, oh yeah, that makes sense to me, or that that kind of jives with what my sense of our family history is. Like, I think in some ways that's a useful evaluator for me of, am I doing this thing accountably, truthfully, honestly, with integrity, and with deep care and love for the people that I love in my life.
Thank you.
Yeah, I fully agree with what you were saying, Carlina. I have somewhat of a bullshit test that I give for all of my work is I read it to my dad, or I send it to my dad to have his opinion on what I write about. Often is, a family dynamic that I'm trying to understand. And, as we all know, with when we try to look into our family histories, there's mostly unknowns and there's mostly many varying shades of gray. And so instead of being maybe true to all of the factual evidence, all of the details, we're more true to like a particular emotion or feeling. And that sounds like maybe it's like, easier to do, but it isn't. It's actually harder to encapsulate that truth within that moment. And especially if you're writing it about someone else or something else that you are trying to open up for other people to see. And it's important to have that person that you send your work to who can look at it and see it for what it is and see what you're trying to do with it at the same time and be gentle with it in that space.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think one thing that I think about in terms of like external ethics when it comes to representation is the idea of like engaging with other writers, even outside of the US. And I think sometimes it can be really tricky when we're writing to sort of recreate this like circle, this literary circle that ends up just being these writers that are from X background or X sort of identity. But then in the end, we're sort of only within this like publishing market that is US centric ultimately. And that's a huge issue, particularly in the case of the Iraqi literary market, for instance, right? Because the Iraqi literary market is full of like every single English book that you can find in the market in the US. You'll find it when you're there in Iraq, and it'll be translated in many different languages, but especially Arabic. Whereas the opposite doesn't happen. Like the US literary market has very, very, very few Iraqi books, whether novels, poetry, whatever. There are very few. And so it's asymmetrical in terms of what enters a book market versus what leaves a book market. And so one thing I think about in terms of this ethics is how much as writers we're actually doing to engage with books in other book markets, but also with writers that are not sharing the same physical locations that we are. And how much of their work are we uplifting? How much of their work are we speaking back to or along with? And those are like little kind of markers that are helpful for me when I'm writing. Is usually the more that I'm struggling, the less that I'm engaging with other work.
Yeah, I'll just add that I agree with all of the comments about kind of diversifying one's readers. I know my partner reads my work or I read it to him, and having other queer writers respond is really important to me. And because I'm also really interested in queer history and queer aging, I feel like from one decade to another, like things look so different from wherever one is sitting. And so trying to have a kind of intergenerational readership is also really important to me.
All right, Bill and Sue, how are we doing on time? I do have one more question, but maybe we should open it up to audience questions or.
Yeah, we've got another 10 minutes. I do have one question in the chat if you'd like me to, I don't know if you can see it on your screen, but I can read it too.
I don't have to. Will you read it?
Okay.
And then if there's time, I'll read my last question.
Okay. So for the panelists, If you were able to see yourself represented in the written word when you were younger, how did it make you feel? And how did it influence who you became as a person and writer? So go back.
I can actually answer that one. The first time I actually saw myself in the written word was in high school. I was in 11th grade, and it was the first time I read Sandra Cisneros' House on Mango Street. I cried. I just cried. I flat out cried. I read it all in one night. I cried. I read it again. I cried some more. Sandra Cisneros has been a huge influence on my life. That's why I'm wearing this shirt. It says Chingona, which is very Sandra Cisneros, and I like to wear it to as many readings as I possibly can. But yeah, that was the first time. That was 11th grade. I was 17 years old. I mean, 16 years old. I mean, it's wild to think that that was the first time I saw anything that even resembled my family in literature. 11th grade. And I was actively looking at the library for something, and had a cool English teacher. So
I love Sandra Cisneros, Monica. So I love The House on Mango Street. I love that book. For me, I think my response maybe, I remember reading Harry Potter when I was younger and seeing Cho Chang as a character in Harry Potter. And I think for me, I think that there was a way in which there was a flicker of recognition of here's an Asian woman character, but she was relegated as the kind of love interest, like very minor, appearance throughout the entire series. And I wanted more. And so I think for me as a kid, it was always this feeling of, a kind of feeling of hunger and just desire for like more complicated, rigorous, like full characters than what I was saying. Sandra Cisneros' work is incredible. And and there were certainly incredible poets of color, queer poets, amazing poets that I found in high school that I felt like basically were the reason why I wanted to become a poet. Araceli Skirmay is a poet who came to visit my high school when I was 14 years old, and it was the first time that I'd ever heard a poet read out loud, let alone seen a poet who wasn't white and a male and older read a poem, and it changed my life. And so that was incredibly just transformative. But I think going back to when I was very young, I think a lot of the texts that I were reading that did reference either Asian American, Asian, or specifically Chinese characters, there was always the sense of, like chopsticks, dumplings, which are certainly a part of our culture, but it's not the whole part, right? And I think I was hungry or curious for more, just like more meaningful, kind of fully 360 degrees writing about us.
Yeah, for me, that moment didn't come until my second year of college. I don't think I'd ever experienced like even like an Arab American writer really when I was growing up. In my second year of college, in an English lit class that I'd kind of just like randomly signed up for, our professor assigned a book called The Corpse Washer by an Iraqi novelist named Sinan Anton. And that was the first setting in which I had read a book by an Iraqi writer, but it was the first setting also where that book was taken seriously, just as seriously as any other novel that we were discussing before. And it changed my life. I mean, I don't even know that I necessarily thought about it in terms of representation then, but it was a moment that gave me the beginnings of a language that has grown with me since then, and also a kind of confidence that there is a lineage, there is something that I am looking back towards as I'm writing, and I didn't have that growing up.
For me, those writers also came early in my teens. I was growing up in the early 90s in the suburbs of St. Louis, before the internet, during Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And I was afraid to even reach for a book that might, call me out as being gay. But I remember reading like Paul Monet's memoir, Becoming a Man, or Tony Kushner's Angels in America, or The Beginning of College, Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin, also encountering Allen Ginsberg early on. These were indicators that I wasn't alone. It made me feel seen. It gave me the beginnings of a map to sort of figure out how I fit into this world. And those points of reference came up for me right away when this conversation was suggested. So appreciate the question.
All right. I think that we kind of have to wrap this up. We're getting near the end of our hour. But thank you to all of our panelists for being on here, Sue and Bill for creating this space, and allowing me to moderate for you all. It's been a blessing to get to connect with you all.
Thank you, Rebecca, too. Even just your description of the definition of kind of what representation, means to you in the start was highly valuable. And you all have given us a huge gift here. I just appreciate you sharing your voices. And we're going to put this video out there, and I hope it takes wings and so many can share in what you've shared. So thank you so much. All right. Well, we will see you the next time. Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.